Hello, and welcome back to Décolonisation le Vietnam, or The History of Indochina. Episode 9, War. Last time, we parted ways after the negotiations between France and the DRV. Those negotiations failed to reach a final agreement, and afterwards, Ho Chi Minh returned to Vietnam empty-handed. Therefore, the question when Ho Chi Minh came back to Vietnam was not anymore if there would be armed conflict between France and the DRV, but rather when would that conflict start. So today's episode will be covering the outbreak of the war between France and the Democratic Republic of Vietnam. So Ho Chi Minh had been absent from the country for 4 months. During his time away, it was Vo Nguyen Giap who took the leadership, and he used this time mainly to prepare for war. So, before turning to the Battle of Hanoi and the first phases of the Indochina War, I think it's appropriate to give you a little more detail about the pedigree of the future General Giap. You remember that we already met him in episode 5, the August Revolution. But today, we'll go more into his background. Vo Nguyen Giap was born in central Vietnam in 1911, and he was therefore only 35 years old in 1946. His father, a low-level Mandarin, had died in the French jail, as did his older sister. So Giap was involved in politics from a very early age. In his memoirs, he said that he was further politicized when he read Ho Chi Minh's Le procès de la colonisation française, which can be translated by French colonization on trial. And Giap read that at the age of 14 years old. After that, he became increasingly involved in nationalist movement and was briefly arrested at 18 for taking part in a student strike. He went on, though, to study at the prestigious Lycée Albert Sarraut in Hanoi, and then attended law school in Hanoi as well. After getting married, he took up a job teaching history at a private school in Hanoi to support his family. And one of his students was Bui Diem, who recounts in his memoir that Giap had a passion for the French Revolution and for the person of Napoleon Bonaparte. In 1937, Giap joined the Communist Party and started writing extensively on national liberation. Then in 1940, Giap was sent by the party to go to China with another young comrade, Pham Van Dong. Their mission was to make contact with Ho Chi Minh. And while he was away, tragedy struck again. His wife was arrested by the French Sûreté and later also died in prison. When he was in China, Giap traveled to Yan'an and underwent military training there with Mao's communist troops. And it was also while in China that Giap forged a close relationship with Ho Chi Minh on the one hand and Pham Van Dong on the other hand. And these three personalities will be holding the reins of power for the next decade in the DRV. Therefore, it's not surprising that Giap was present at the creation of the Viet Minh in May 1941. And at the end of 1944, he was given the task of creating the movement's armed wing. And saying that they started very small is an understatement. Imagine that these guys were only 31 men and 3 women. And they had between them 1 light machine gun, 17 rifles, 2 revolvers, and 14 various weapons. So basically, the Tran Hung Dao Brigade, named after the Viet hero we saw in episode 1, well, that brigade was not the most fearsome outfit out there. As one of Ho Chi Minh's closest lieutenants, Giap was appointed Interior Minister in the first DRV government. And it is in this position that he became really the key player in the DRV after Ho Chi Minh, with his energy, his efficiency, but also his ruthlessness. As a result, It was not a surprise to see him seize the reins when Ho Chi Minh left for France with Pham Van Dong. And Giap had his work cut out for him. His assignment was nothing less than to develop a military strategy to deal with the French, considering that the French firepower was 1,000 times greater than the DRV's. So what did he do? To this end, what Giap did was to adapt Mao Zedong theories about the People's War. Remember, Giap has studied in Yan'an, so he knew this. What is Mao Zedong theory about the People's War? Well, to keep it simple, Mao identified 3 phases in the People's War. The first phase is called strategic defense. What it means is that when faced with an enemy with superior firepower, one has to avoid conventional battles in favor of guerrilla warfare. After that, there's a second phase of equilibrium, where attacks must be increased to undermine the enemy's morale. And when the enemy's morale is at 0, it is the general offensive, where conventional combat is used to finish off the enemy. So that was the plan: guerrilla, harassment, and general offensive. So as early as April 1946, Giap started preparing for war. The first thing he did was to create 2 military bases in very remote regions. The thinking was that those bases would be sanctuaries for his forces, but also he would use them to launch guerrilla actions in the more populated areas. The largest base was the Viet in the northern region along the Chinese border. That region was very well adapted for many reasons. First of all, it was a remote region, it was sparsely populated, and it was a region that the communists knew very well because that's where they were based during World War II. However, preparing for war was not Giap's only assignment. Another objective of his was to assert the DRV's authority on the territory it controlled. And this is what Frederick Logevall, in his book The Embers of War, that I recommend very, very much and that I used a lot for this episode, this is what Frederick Logevall says about that period. Quote, "In other respects too, Vo Nguyen Giap used the spring and summer months to strengthen the Viet Minh position. In May, the Chinese forces began to withdraw across the Sino-Vietnamese frontier. The French sought to move in quickly, but were for the most part stymied. It was the wet season, and Giap's troops were nimbler at navigating the difficult conditions and establishing control of the evacuated areas. Adept at sabotaging roads and bridges, they continually frustrated the road-bound French, delaying them long enough to take scores of important towns and villages out of play. Inevitably, there were military clashes. At Bac Ninh, a village 19 miles northwest of Hanoi, for example, a Viet Minh unit's ambush of a French truck convoy on August 4 led to a fierce 9-hour battle involving machine guns, mortars, and grenades. Casualties were heavy on both sides, with the French suffering 12 men killed and 41 wounded. Tensions rose." End quote. So we can see there that Giap really stood up to the French. At the same time, the third assignment that Giap had is that he transformed northern Vietnam into a police state. Taking advantage of the Chinese withdrawal, he ruthlessly eliminated hundreds, if not thousands, of VNQDD and Dai Viet militants. I will not go into more details just yet about this crackdown on non-communist nationalists, but in next episode, I will have more to say about what is, for all intents and purposes, the start of a long Vietnamese civil war. But let's not make it sound like Giap breezed through all that we just described. No, he actually had to perform a difficult balancing act. On the one hand, he had to assert the sovereignty of the DRV and not give an inch to the French. But on the other hand, He knew that his army was not a match for the French Expeditionary Corps. So he had to do everything to delay an all-out war that would destroy his forces. And that's what he managed to do. When Ho Chi Minh returned to Vietnam at the end of October 1946, the ceasefire still held, even though tensions were running very high. In the north, the French troops, as we've seen, were frustrated. They were basically pinned down in Hanoi and Haiphong, surrounded by the Viet Minh troops who were preventing them from deploying in other areas of the country. In the south, the situation was even worse, if you can believe it. France controlled all the major cities, including Saigon, home to the puppet government of the Republic of Cochin China, led by Dr. Thing. But outside the major urban centers, French control was very fragile. Why? Well, Viet Minh guerrilla led by Nguyen Binh were running amok. You see, what happened is that the most seasoned French troops had been transferred to the north after the March the 6th Agreement. As a result, Viet Minh guerrilla actions increased exponentially, and by late October, France controlled no more than 25% of Cochin China, meaning Nam Quay, the southern region. So a very alarming security situation in Cochin China. But the political situation was also worrying for the French, as shown by the suicide on the 10th of November 1946 of Dr. Thien, the president of the Autonomous Republic of Cochin China. Like the Mandarin Phan Thanh Giang, who committed suicide when France completed its invasion of southern Vietnam in 1867, Dr. Thien decided to take his own life when it became clear to him that he was just a puppet that Dargent was using to make things harder for the Viet Minh. And on the very day Dr. Thien died, Thierry Dargent learned more bad news. His sense of urgency was strengthened by the major communist gains in the French parliamentary elections. Dargent, who was a staunch Catholic conservative, feared that the French communists would threaten the prospects of an unyielding French posture in Indochina. So to sum it up, there are three factors here that you have to remember. There's a deteriorating security situation in the south. There's a worsening of the political situation with Dr. Thien's suicide. Dr. Thien had been handpicked by the French, and his suicide is a catastrophe. If you add to that the communists are now in charge in Paris, Dargent and his military chief, General Valluy, came to a conclusion. They really had to act decisively against the Ho Chi Minh regime in the north if they wanted to stop the rot. Namely, they had to neutralize the Ho Chi Minh's government if they wanted to keep Indochina French. And all this was not lost on the Viet Minh, who put his troops on alert, especially around Haiphong, the major northern port. And it's not a coincidence if the problem started in Haiphong. Haiphong was a super important city for both sides. On the one hand, it was key to the French hopes in the north as its harbor serviced the needs of Hanoi and all the Red River Delta. On the other hand, for the DRV, not only were they smuggling weapons into the country through Haiphong Harbor, but it was also one of the few areas where the DRV could generate revenue by levying custom duties on goods. And as you know, customs are also a visible sign of a country's sovereignty. And the DRV was not willing to relinquish any of that sovereignty to the French. The French and the Vietnamese controlled different parts of the city, and they often clashed over the right to collect custom duties. So it was in Haiphong, on the 20th of November, that the spiral towards war began. What happened? Initially, a Chinese smuggler's boat transporting gasoline was intercepted by a French ship. You know, this is French Indochina and everything. However, The French boat was in turn intercepted by DRV troops. And these guys were saying, this is independent Vietnam, we do customs around here. So these Vietnamese troops put the entire French crew under arrest. When they saw that, other French troops attempted to rescue their compatriots. Shots were fired, more soldiers became involved, and soon the fighting spread throughout the city, and by nightfall, 240 Vietnamese and 7 French lay dead. The next day, though, French and Vietnamese agreed to a ceasefire, and the situation would have remained unchanged had General Vallée not sought to exploit the incident for strategic advantage. On November the 22nd, Vallée sent a message to the French commander in Haiphong, a guy called Debes. Quote, "Following the event of the 20th, I consider it essential to take advantage of the incident to improve our position in Haiphong. The time has come to teach a hard lesson to those who have treacherously attacked us. By every means at your disposal, you must take complete control of Haiphong and force the Vietnamese government and army to submission. You will make President Ho face up to his overwhelming responsibilities and the heavy consequences that his attitude towards the French government may have." End quote. So there it was in writing. Vallée was going to confront Ho Chi Minh and bring him to his senses. The next day, November the 23rd, General Debes followed orders and issued an ultimatum demanding full withdrawal of the Vietnamese forces from Haiphong and the disarmament of all militiamen. The Vietnamese refused to comply, and Debes ordered a general attack supported by naval, aerial, and artillery bombardment. That attack reduced the Vietnamese and Chinese quarters to rubble, killing at least thousands of people. Henri Martin, a French sailor serving on a warship, just like Pierre Loti 60 years earlier, testified, quote, "When we visited Haiphong afterwards, all the Vietnamese neighborhoods were completely wiped out. There were dead people buried under the debris. The larger part of the city, almost the entire Vietnamese part of the city, had been destroyed." End quote. Interestingly, Vallée, who at the time was acting High Commissioner because d'Argentlieu had gone to Paris, Vallée did not seek prior authorization from the government before ordering the shelling of Haiphong. As was often the case with Vietnam, what prevailed was act first and ask permission later. But there was no doubt that Vallée had the full backing of his boss, Thierry d'Argentlieu, because the next day, d'Argentlieu cabled his congratulations from Paris. After kicking the DRV troops out of Haiphong, General Vallée sent an ultimatum to Ho Chi Minh with 3 demands. 1. All Vietnamese troops had to evacuate Haiphong and never come back. 2. Only French forces would control customs. And 3. Complete freedom of movement for French troops had to be guaranteed throughout the northern region. The Ho Chi Minh's government's back was to the wall. Not only had it suffered a humiliating loss of sovereignty in Haiphong, but there was also every reason to believe that the same scenario would be repeated in Hanoi. So the choice was simple: either give in to the French then and there, or resist and risk starting a war with an awesome enemy. At the last minute, there were last-ditch attempts to negotiate something between the DRV and France. For example, Jean Saint-Denis came back from Paris to talk to his old friend Ho Chi Minh out of military action. There was also hope from the Vietnamese side that the new government led by Léon Blum, that had just been sworn in, could take a different course. But that government was weak. It was a transitional government with no real power to make major colonial decisions. But the momentum towards confrontation was just too strong on both sides anyway. And who knew it better were the people of Hanoi. In early December, thousands of residents starting to flee the capital, sensing the combats that were coming. The city itself was a military zone. all over town, there were checkpoints separating French and Vietnamese controlled areas. Everybody knew what was coming. What we now know is that Giap's plan was to force the French into a bloody urban battle in Hanoi. By compelling them to fight house by house and street by street, Giap wanted to enable the Viet Minh government and his 30,000 regular army troops to evacuate the city for the security of the Viet Bac base. And the ones who would be facing the French in Hanoi were the thousands of Viet Minh militiamen in the city. These guys dug up the street, built roadblocks, and cut holes between houses to facilitate troop movements. They were not very seasoned for sure, and their equipment was rudimentary, but there were many of them, and this battle would be fought on their turf. On the 17th of December, clashes broke out between Vietnamese militiamen and French soldiers with heavy casualties on both sides, prompting General Viet to say, quote, and trigger warning, I'm going to be using a racist term here, because General Viet said, quote, if these gooks want to fight, they'll get it, end quote. On the 18th, Viet issued a final ultimatum to the Viet Minh, announcing that only French units would be in charge of maintaining order in Hanoi, meaning that the Vietnamese forces had to lay down their weapons. In response, Ho Chi Minh gave the order to attack French installations. The attack started on December 19th at 8 p.m. when an awesome explosion at Hanoi's power station shook the city and plunged it into darkness. That was a signal that the Viet Minh militiamen had been waiting for. They opened up on French positions and fighting began all over the city. And the next day, it spread to other cities, and Ho Chi Minh issued a famous call to resistance. Quote, let all Vietnamese, men and women, young and old, without distinction of religion, party, or nationality, rise up to fight the French colonialists to save the fatherland. Join the struggle with all the means at your disposal. He who has a gun, let him use his gun. He who has a sword, let him use his sword. And if you don't have a sword, pick axes and sticks. Let everyone put all their strength into fighting colonialism to save the fatherland. End quote. The Battle of Hanoi had started. French officers were hoping to seal off and destroy Viet Minh forces in Hanoi in a few days. And French forces moved quickly to seize control of the key buildings and installations in the city. However, to their disappointment, they found out that the Viet Minh leadership had quietly slipped away from the city. For the remainder of December 1946, fighting raged in Hanoi. Gradually, the French military pushed back the Viet Minh militiamen, but massive destruction was brought on the city and fires turned several districts into ruins. The Viet Minh militiamen retreated and barricaded themselves in the Chinese and Vietnamese neighborhoods. And there, they held their ground until mid-February 1947. How did they do it? Well, the area had been littered with as many barricades as possible. Many of those barricades were rigged with mines, and the French soldiers had no answer for the ghosts who would fire on them and then disappear in the labyrinths of homes, the walls of which had been pierced to allow movements. So it took 2 months before the Viet Minh units withdrew from the city under the cover of darkness, taking with them what remained of the Vietnamese population. The Vietnamese had succeeded in pinning down the French in Hanoi, thereby enabling the government and the main military force to reach the Viet Bac mountain base. Hanoi was now under French control in February 1947, but it was an empty shell. Almost all Vietnamese inhabitants had fled the city. So to finish off today, I can say that whichever date you choose as the start of the Indochina War, whether it is September 1945 in Saigon, or November 1946 in Haiphong, or December 1946 in Hanoi, By February 1947, the Indochina War had well and truly begun. And although the Viet Minh fired first, crossing the Rubicon from a French perspective, it cannot be held entirely responsible for the outbreak of war. No, in my opinion, the responsibility for the war must be laid at the feet of the French. Throughout 1946, Thierry d'Argentlieu had undermined any efforts to reach a negotiated solution. But the High Commissioner's goal of keeping Indochina French was also shared by all French political personnel, especially Bidault's ruling party, the MRP in Paris. Bidault shared de Gaulle's intimate conviction that France should remain, quote, united with the territories it had opened up to civilization, end quote. So in order to remain united with Indochina, France kicked the Viet Minh out of Hanoi. At that point, everyone already knew that this would be more than an 8-day police operation, but no one imagined that it would last at least 8 years. Next week, we will pause a little bit and take a look back at events I have so far neglected to recount. We will look at the tension between the Viet Minh and other nationalist movements, and we will try to understand the beginnings of the Vietnamese Civil War in 1946. In the meantime, I'd like to thank you for your loyalty and ask you, if you haven't already done so, to leave us a rating or a comment or a heart on Apple Podcasts or Spotify. It will nudge the algorithm to offer the podcast to a wider audience. Thank you and see you next time.